This is the story of 3 boys. One is in hiding for his life. 2 are already dead. Lewis Johnson was 16 when he was fatally stabbed. Corey Jr. Davis shot dead at 14. This is also the story of 3 mothers and the desperate fight to find somewhere safe to live.
My son was beaten up on my doorstep.
I believe that it was the direct cause of his death.
For me, if that was a correct property, my son could still be there. And that's the biggest thing ever.
As we investigated cases of young people who'd been criminally exploited or murdered, again and again housing came up as a critical issue. Families spoke of an endless merry-go-round of temporary accommodation in different areas, their child's education massively disrupted or sometimes ended altogether. And at the very extremes, families living with the threat of violence on their doorstep, only being moved once that violence had had fatal consequences. Now the man who headed up one of the biggest police forces in the country is calling for radical change.
You've got to really prioritise when there is a threat to life, and particularly when there's a threat to the life of a young person. And that's why I'd argue why the whole system should give these sorts of cases higher priority.
I'm trapped.
Marcia, not her real name, shows us the damage after the latest attack on her family home. A brick thrown through the window, showering shards of glass inside, as her 3 children, 11, 9 and 6, sat on the sofa.
Now I'm even scared to stay in the house, and I'm also scared to go out of the house.
She says it's part of a 3-year-long campaign of intimidation and violence by a local gang. They tried to recruit her eldest son into selling drugs when he was 13. Since then, the family home has been a target.
I received a number of death threats. I received threats that they wanted to stab him. I received threats that they wanted to kill him. My son was beaten up on my doorstep. I've had rats thrown through my letterbox.
Marcia says she's been trying to get moved for years.
I can't take it anymore. I've tried everything. God, I've been suffering so long in this place, and nothing. I don't want to lose any of my children. I just need somewhere safe for them, and I'll be okay.
It's not that the authorities are unaware of the risk.
So this is a fireproof letterbox that was put in by the violence reduction team. They recommended it to be put in because the violence keep escalating each time, and they're not sure if they could put a fire bomb or something through the letterbox.
There's a police rapid response order on the house. But she says when she phoned about the brick, she was told to stop ringing 999, to go online. It's not an emergency. For Marcia, it is exactly that. She's had to abandon a nursing degree and to send her son abroad for his own safety.
I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to get my kids in the right place so that they will never turn to criminality as a way out.
She wonders what it will take for people to listen.
They just don't care. They just leave families in these conditions and turn a blind eye until when something happens like a murder, that's when they start jumping around.
It took for my son to lose his life for them to give us a home.
7 years in temporary housing ended for Natalie Secker and her 4 children, only after one of those children was murdered. 16-year-old Lewis was the victim of a postcode war between rival gangs in London. There are many complicated factors in stories like his, but his mother is in no doubt. The family's long fight for a home was key.
We came home one day and the locks had been changed.
Illegally evicted by a private landlord, the family were given temporary accommodation by the local authority.
The temporary accommodation they put us in, the rent was almost £2,000 a month. And just when that happened, the housing benefit cap came in. I had no way of paying the shortfall. Very quickly we fell into rent arrears, and they evicted me from my temporary accommodation because of rent arrears.
Natalie and her 4 children then crisscrossed London, a dizzying array of locations, moving a total of 9 times in 7 years.
We were put in Leytonstone, Thornton Heath, Battersea, Woolwich, Plumstead, Croydon, Tooting, West Norwood, all over the place. We were living out of bin bags. We had no furniture at the end, we had no possessions, everything was gone.
So how did you move in the end?
We used to call an Uber, we used to move in a taxi.
Too far away to stay in his old school, Lewis ended up out of education for months, then in a pupil referral unit, normally for excluded pupils, because there were no other places available. After so many moves, Natalie says he ended up on the wrong side of a postcode war.
I believe that it was the direct cause of his death. Lewis felt that he didn't have much of a home life, and he didn't, because we didn't have a permanent home, but also it placed him at real risk. A child or a young person that's not from the postcode where you're living at is extremely vulnerable. It needs to be taken seriously. You cannot play Russian roulette with these young people's lives.
Former Chief Constable Fahy now chairs the Plus Dane Housing Association. He wants families of criminally exploited children to be given the same priority as victims of domestic violence when it comes to finding safe accommodation.
It's got many of the same features of domestic violence, a high degree of risk, a high degree of threat, people who are determined to try and get to somebody and do them harm. Unless the agencies work together, unless alternative housing is provided, then clearly that family will continue to suffer incidents, and the authorities will continue to be called out to try and deal with that.
Social housing is under enormous pressure.
Yes, you're right. They are under huge pressure. But at the end of the day, you've got to really prioritise when there is a threat to life, and particularly when there's a threat to the life of a young person. And that's why I'd argue why the whole system should give these sorts of cases higher priority.
Keisha's son Corey was 14 when he was shot dead in 2017. She believes a promised move which never came might have helped save his life. Keisha found out Corey was being forced to sell drugs when he was just 13 by a local gang. Terrified, he told her she destroyed the drugs, but it left her son vulnerable.
A lot of people, social service, and saying that we needed a move, and they agreed that we should be granted a move. And so that was really what we was very hopeful for.
Months later, a letter came through saying a house had been found.
We could view the house on street view, and we could see that it had a back garden, it had a driveway. He could see how he had a side door to park his bike. He himself then started looking for the schools in the area. He was really chuffed.
Within days, the offer had been withdrawn. It was a mistake. Keisha says Corey was left broken.
He looked at the letter. I saw, it's like I say this about little situations. When you see a bright light on somebody dim, and I saw that in his face. And I'll never forget that look, because he just walked out the house. He didn't even say, "Bye, Mum."
5 months after it's agreed that Corey and his mum needed to be moved, Corey is killed. As with so many young people caught up in criminal exploitation, Corey faced many problems. But Keisha is in no doubt. The lack of a safe place he could call home was one of the biggest.
These people don't really understand what that letter did, and what that type of mistake made. Because for me, if that was a correct property, my son could still be here. And that's the biggest thing ever.
After Corey died, Keisha finally got her move.
There needs to be a wider recognition, and certainly there needs to be some funding to support these families, because what we know is if we don't support them in the early stages, if we don't protect them, then ultimately, if you want to look at it in economic terms, they will end up costing the system a lot of money if that young person ends up in custody, or sadly, tragically ends up being murdered.
What do you think Lewis would have made of finally getting a permanent home like this?
He would have been overjoyed. He would have loved it. I feel so sad because we're here and he's never been here, he's never seen it. Sad.
Well, since we filmed with Marcia, the mother whose home has been under attack, she and her family have recently been moved into temporary accommodation. In a statement tonight, a government spokesperson said, "Protecting young people from violence is a priority for the government, and council should prioritise those who need urgent rehousing as a result of violence or its threat."